The people who designed punishments throughout history weren't trying to stop crime. They were trying to have fun doing it. And the further back you look, the more obvious that becomes. We like to imagine that justice has always been this serious, solemn thing. Scales, blindfolds, marble columns. But the actual record tells a completely different story. The actual record is full of iron masks, greased animals, and men being forced to eat their own paperwork. What we're going to walk through today isn't a list of cruel moments from the past. It's something more disturbing than that. It's a pattern. Because once you start looking at how punishment actually worked across different cultures and eras, you stop seeing random cruelty, and you start seeing something that looks a lot like creativity. Deliberate, enthusiastic, wildly imaginative creativity. And that's the part that should unsettle you. Pain alone was never enough for the people running these systems. They wanted meaning. They wanted theater. They wanted the lesson to be felt in the body, remembered by the crowd, and visible from the other side of the market square. Some of what we'll get into had a cold logic behind it that's almost hard to argue with. Some of it was something else entirely, something that wore the costume of justice while being driven by something much darker underneath. The line between those two things turns out to be thinner than you'd hope, and by the time we get to the end of all this, I think you'll start noticing that some of these ideas didn't actually disappear. They just changed their clothes and updated their language. We're going to move through these roughly from psychological to physical, from the subtle to the outright bizarre, because that's the arc that hits hardest. Start with the mind, then work outward. So let's begin where the whole thing gets genuinely strange. Not with a dungeon, not with a blade, but with a dinner party. A perfectly set table. Candles burning low, the smell of roasted meat drifting through a hall, draped entirely in black fabric from floor to ceiling. And every single guest sitting completely still, too frightened to chew. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do us both a favor and hit subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and there's a lot more where this came from. Now picture yourself sitting at that table. You received an invitation you couldn't refuse from someone whose mood determined whether you went home that evening or didn't go home at all. You walked in expecting something terrible and found instead a banquet. Real food, real wine, real warmth from the fire. But the walls were black, the candles were black, and right in front of you, where a place card might normally sit, was a stone marker carved with your full name. Not a threat written on paper, not a guard standing behind your chair, just your name in stone, staring back at you across the soup. The host sat at the head of the table, perfectly calm, eating normally, occasionally making pleasant conversation about nothing in particular. And that calmness was the cruelest part, because there was no signal, no moment where you could read the room and know whether this was theater or whether tonight was actually the night. So you sat there for hours, completely suspended between relief and absolute dread, eating food that tasted like nothing because every bite required you to first check whether swallowing it might somehow be the wrong move. And then, after all of it, after the plates were cleared and the candles burned lower, and the silence had soaked into your bones, the host simply thanked everyone for coming. Servants opened the doors. Guests were allowed to leave. No explanation, no follow-up, no resolution to any of it. just the quiet walk home through the dark, your name still carved in stone somewhere behind you. And the knowledge that the whole evening had been a demonstration of one very simple point. Your life was not yours. It was on loan, and the lender had just reminded you of the terms. No blade required. That dinner party trick was sophisticated. It required planning, fabric, stone carvers, and a host with enough self-control to sit through hours of his own theater without flinching. But here's the thing about power and punishment across history. Not every authority had that kind of patience. Some of them found something even more effective than fear. They found laughter. And laughter, it turns out, cuts in ways that candle-lit dread simply cannot reach. There was a practice that showed up in busy public markets, the kind of places packed with noise and smell and the constant press of strangers. Cloth merchants arguing prices, food vendors shouting, animals being traded, coins changing hands. The perfect environment for a skilled thief who knew how to move through a crowd without leaving a ripple. But when one of those thieves got caught, the response wasn't a cell or a beating. It was something that would follow that person for the rest of their life in a way that bruises never could. The thief was blindfolded, hands tied loosely enough to stumble but not to grab, and then released into the middle of the market square to chase a live animal that had been deliberately made impossible to catch. Not a fast animal necessarily, just an unpredictable one, slick and panicked and completely indifferent to the humiliation happening around it. The crowd didn't need to be told to watch. The crowd was already there. And within seconds the entire square had reorganized itself around the spectacle. Vendors leaned over their stalls, children climbed onto anything they could find, and the thief stumbled and lurched and grasped at nothing, while the animal darted in directions that made no physical sense. The sounds were what I keep coming back to when I think about this. The wet slap of boots in mud. The burst of laughter from one corner that spread like fire across dry grass until the whole square was roaring. And underneath all of it, the ragged breathing of someone who had probably stolen out of desperation and was now paying for it in a currency far more expensive than anything they'd taken. Because here's what the authorities understood that we sometimes forget. Pain is private. You can endure pain behind closed eyes, inside your own head, in a place no one else can reach. But humiliation is public by definition. It only exists in the presence of witnesses. And a market full of witnesses. Witnesses who would go home that evening and tell the story over dinner. Witnesses whose children would repeat it the next morning. That was a punishment with a reach that no physical sentence could match. The thief didn't just suffer that afternoon. The thief became a story. And stories in small, tight communities have a way of never fully dying. What the crowd got was entertainment. What the authorities got was a warning, delivered to every single person watching. And what the thief got was something they'd feel every time they walked through that market for years afterward. The particular cold feeling of being recognized not as a person, but as the person, that one time, that one afternoon in the mud, the one everyone laughed at. And the animal, somewhere on the other side of the square by then, completely unbothered, already thinking about something else entirely. Now here's where things stop being funny. Because everything we've covered so far, the psychological theater of that black-draped dinner, the public comedy of the market square. Those were punishments designed to control and humiliate. But some crimes, in some places, triggered something completely different. Something that makes the blindfolded chase look like a minor inconvenience. There were offenses that certain societies considered so fundamentally wrong, so far outside the boundaries of what a human being was supposed to be capable of, that ordinary punishment felt almost like an insult to the severity of what had happened. And when that line was crossed, the response stopped being about control or humiliation or even deterrence. It became about making a statement loud enough that every generation afterward would hear it. The condemned wasn't simply removed. They were placed inside a sealed container with several living creatures, all of them frightened, all of them unpredictable, all of them responding to the darkness and the confined space in the way that frightened animals do. Then the whole thing was sent into deep water. What strikes me most about this isn't the horror of it, though the horror is real enough. It's the deliberateness. Someone sat down and thought this through. Someone made choices, specific choices, about exactly what would go into that container and why. Because every element was symbolic. Every creature represented something the society wanted to say about what this person had done. It wasn't chaos. It was a message, composed carefully, signed by the entire legal system, and delivered in the most irreversible way imaginable. Death would have made the condemned a memory. This made them a warning etched so deep into the culture that people were still talking about it generations later. And that was exactly the intention, not to end a life, to end the very idea that a life like that could exist without consequence reaching all the way down to the bottom. Some punishments were designed to terrify, some were designed to entertain. But the ones that have always fascinated me most are the ones that were designed to be perfectly, almost mathematically, fair. No drama, no spectacle, no sealed containers or darkened banquet halls. Just a clean, simple equation. You made something dishonest. Now you live inside that dishonesty until you understand it from the inside. There was a category of punishment that kept appearing across completely different cultures, in different parts of the world, in different centuries, and yet the logic behind all of them was identical. If you created something fraudulent and sold it to people who trusted you, the sentence was not a fine. It was not a public chase or a symbolic death. The sentence was consumption. A merchant caught diluting his goods, stretching them with cheaper materials, passing off something worthless as something valuable, was made to take back every bit of what he had sold. Not symbolically, literally. Whatever he had fraudulently produced, he sat with it until it was gone. And I want you to really picture what that looked like in practice. Not the clean, abstract version of it, the real version. A man sitting in front of his own stall, the same stall where he had been confident and convincing an hour earlier, now working his way through the very product he had been so proud to sell. The texture of it, the smell of it up close, far closer than any customer ever got. The taste of something you made with shortcuts, made with contempt for the person who would eventually receive it, now sitting in your own mouth with nowhere to go. The crowd around him wasn't loud the way the Market Square crowd was loud during the chase. This crowd was quieter, more interested, because this wasn't comedy. This was something more uncomfortable than comedy. This was a man being made to experience his own dishonesty as a physical sensation, and everyone watching understood exactly what they were seeing. What made this category of punishment so effective wasn't the discomfort of the act itself, though that was real enough. It was the intimacy of it. The fraudster and his fraud, face to face, with no distance between them and no way to explain it away. You couldn't argue with it. You couldn't appeal to a higher authority. The evidence was right there, and you were eating it. And the most important thing, the thing that made this stick in people's memories long after the event itself, was how completely it removed any dignity from the crime. Theft could be made to look bold. Deception could be made to look clever. But sitting in public, working through your own shoddy product while strangers watched in silence, that looked like exactly what it was. Small, calculated, petty, and completely, visibly, undeniably yours. Now take that same instinct, that desire to make the punishment reflect the crime in the most direct and visible way possible, and scale it up. Because some communities weren't satisfied with making the offender consume their dishonesty in private discomfort. They wanted the lesson to be worn, carried, displayed on the body like a sign that everyone could read from across the street. And this is where human creativity in the field of punishment reaches a level that is genuinely hard to categorize. Is it cruel? Absolutely. Is it also in some deeply strange way kind of ingenious? Also yes. There were devices, heavy iron constructions, that were designed not to injure, but to announce. Locked around a person and shaped specifically to communicate what that person had done. The shape itself was the sentence. An offender known for being disruptive and loud was fitted with something that froze them in a posture of ridiculous helplessness, arms extended, neck fixed, unable to move with any natural dignity at all. And then they were walked through the town, not rushed, not hidden, walked slowly through the busiest streets, past the market, past the places where people gathered in the middle of the day. The sounds that came with it were particular, the dull clank of iron on stone with each step, the shift in conversations as people turned to look, then looked away, then looked back again because they couldn't help it, and the silence of the person wearing it, because there was nothing to say, no expression available to them that wouldn't make it worse. The weight of those devices was real and physical, cold metal against skin in winter, burning hot under a midday sun in summer. But the weight that mattered wasn't measured in iron. It was measured in eyes. Every pair of eyes that followed that slow walk through town added something to the sentence that no blacksmith could have calculated when he made the thing. And the community understood its role perfectly. They weren't just witnesses, they were participants. Their attention was part of the mechanism. Without them looking, the device was just uncomfortable metalwork. With them looking, it became something that could reshape a person's entire relationship with the town they lived in. But here's what I find most interesting about this particular method, and it's something that gets overlooked when people focus on how strange and harsh these devices were. The punishment had a very specific target, not the body, not even really the mind. It was aimed directly at the one thing that held communities together and tore them apart in equal measure: reputation. And what comes next shows just how far some systems were willing to go to destroy that single thing completely. Destroying someone's reputation through iron and public spectacle was effective. But some systems looked at that approach and decided it still required too much effort, too much metal, too much planning, too much reliance on a crowd showing up at the right moment. What if you could destroy a person completely, stripped them of everything that made them dangerous or relevant without touching them at all. Without a device, without a parade, without a single witness needing to be present. What if the punishment was simply the removal of everything that made their life worth living, and you did it by sending them somewhere that had none of it? They were powerful men, genuinely powerful men, who had spent decades building networks of influence so dense and layered that removing them from the center of that network felt impossible. They knew where the bodies were buried. Metaphorically speaking. They had allies in every important room. They could whisper a name and change the outcome of decisions made 3 cities away. These were not men you could simply embarrass with iron devices or public walks. These were men whose power lived in proximity, in being present, in being reachable. And so the answer was elegant in its brutality. You didn't cage them. You didn't parade them. You simply moved them. Far enough away that their whisper couldn't reach anyone who mattered. Far enough that their letters arrived weeks late, if they arrived at all. Far enough that the network they had spent a lifetime building began to fray at the edges, then unravel from the middle, then collapse entirely under the weight of their absence. The location itself was chosen with care, not somewhere dramatic, not somewhere that could be made to sound romantic or tragic in the retelling. Somewhere genuinely unremarkable. Somewhere with difficult terrain and bad weather, and no social infrastructure whatsoever. Somewhere that would feel, to a man used to marble floors and candle-lit dinners and the constant low hum of political conversation, like being buried alive in a place that didn't even have the decency to be interesting. And here's the thing that made it so effective. The man himself often survived perfectly well in a physical sense. He ate, he slept, he was not harmed. But every morning he woke up to the same view, the same silence, the same absence of everything that had previously constituted his entire identity. No one needed his opinion. No one was waiting for his signal. The decisions that used to require his presence were being made without him, and made just fine, which was perhaps the most devastating part of all. He didn't just lose his position. He lost the evidence that his position had ever been necessary. And the people who sent him there knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't punishing the body. They were dismantling the self. Piece by piece, day by day, with nothing but distance and silence as the tools. Execution would have made him a story worth telling. This made him a footnote that even his allies eventually stopped bothering to reference. Now here's where it gets almost philosophically interesting, because everything we've covered so far involved someone in authority making a decision, a host staging his dinner, officials designing their iron devices, a powerful figure ordering an exile. All of these punishments had a single source, a single will behind them, a single person or institution deciding what the sentence would be. But one system looked at all of that and said, what if we removed the authority figure entirely? What if the punishment came from everyone? Not a ruler, not a court, not an official with a title, just the entire population of a city, collectively, calmly, and with remarkable procedural efficiency, deciding that a specific person needed to leave. The method was almost insultingly simple. People gathered. They wrote a name on a piece of broken pottery, the cheapest, most ordinary material imaginable, the kind of thing you swept off the floor without a second thought. And if enough names matched, that person left for 10 years. No accusation of wrongdoing was required. No crime needed to have been committed. The only charge, if you could even call it that, was being the kind of person that enough of your fellow citizens had independently decided they were tired of dealing with. Think about what that actually felt like from the inside. You hadn't been caught doing anything. You hadn't been dragged before a judge. You had simply been living your life, being exactly the kind of person you had always been. And then one morning you discovered that the entire city had quietly, individually, without coordinating with each other, arrived at the same conclusion about you. The loneliness of that realization is something I find genuinely hard to get past when I think about it. Because it wasn't anger. Anger you can argue with. It wasn't fear. Fear you can address. It was something colder and more final than either of those things. It was consensus. And there is almost nothing in human experience more isolating than the moment you understand that the people around you have reached a unanimous verdict about your presence. And that verdict is that they would simply prefer the world without you in it for a while. 10 years is a long time. Long enough for your allies to find new allies. Long enough for your name to stop coming up in conversations that matter. Long enough for the city to quietly, thoroughly forget what it felt like when you were still part of it. And that forgetting, it turns out, was the whole point. That quiet democratic exile is chilling precisely because it requires no villain. No one person decided your fate. No one lost their temper or made a power move or acted out of personal grudge. The city just exhaled, and you were gone. But now I want to shift from the collective to the deeply personal, because some of the most effective punishments in history weren't about crowds or systems or votes. They were about something far more intimate. They were about the body being forced to carry what the mind wanted to hide. In societies where your appearance was your standing, where the way you walked into a room determined how people spoke to you, how they deferred to you, whether they looked you in the eye or looked away, the most devastating thing an authority could do had nothing to do with pain or exile or iron devices. It was something simpler and somehow worse. They made you look wrong. Not injured, not marked with a visible wound that might invite sympathy. Just wrong. Asymmetrical in a way that the eye couldn't stop catching. Half of a man's head shaved clean to the scalp, the other half left completely untouched. One side the way he had always presented himself to the world. The other side stripped bare, pale skin where there should have been hair. The line between them so precise it looked almost deliberate in the way that only official humiliation can look deliberate. And the thing is, it was. Every detail was intentional. The barber who did it wasn't careless. He was an instrument of the sentence, working with the same professional focus as any craftsman, because the result needed to be clear and symmetrical in its asymmetry. Clear enough that anyone who saw it from 10 feet away understood immediately, without being told, that this was not an accident or a personal choice. This was a punishment wearing a face. The man had to keep moving through his daily life. He still had to walk to the market, still had to interact with neighbors, still had to be present in the spaces where his reputation had previously existed intact. And every single one of those interactions now began with the same moment. The fraction of a second where the other person's eyes moved to the wrong side of his head and then quickly, pointedly, moved away again. That tiny movement, that small, involuntary flinch of recognition was the sentence being served over and over in real time. Not once in a courtroom, hundreds of times a day in every ordinary moment of his ordinary life, until the hair grew back and the punishment was officially over. But the memory of those looks, the memory of what his own reflection had shown him every morning during those weeks, that didn't grow back at the same rate as the hair. The body as a display case for shame. That's what we've been circling around, and now we reach the version of it that drops any remaining pretense of subtlety. Because if shaving half a head was intimate and personal and designed to operate quietly in the background of daily life, what came next in certain punishment traditions was the opposite of quiet. It was designed to be impossible to look away from, and it was designed specifically for the people whose crimes had been the most visible, the most public, the most theatrical in their offense. If you had made a spectacle of yourself, the response was to make a spectacle of your consequences. There were arenas, large public spaces where crowds gathered not for commerce or ceremony, but purely for the event of watching. And into those spaces, authorities occasionally sent people whose crimes were considered minor enough that execution felt disproportionate, but significant enough that a quiet sentence felt insufficient. The solution was to place those people into situations of complete, engineered helplessness and let the crowd watch what happened. Not a structured contest. Not something with clear rules and a dignified arc. Something deliberately chaotic. Two people placed together with no meaningful way to navigate the situation, stripped of the tools that would make the experience manageable, and left to stumble through it while hundreds of people watched from above. The crowd's laughter wasn't incidental. It was the point. The officials who designed these situations understood that there is a particular kind of suffering that only exists when it's being watched and found funny. Pain alone, in private, can be endured with something resembling dignity. Pain that is simultaneously absurd, that makes the person experiencing it look ridiculous rather than tragic, that generates laughter rather than sympathy. That is a completely different animal. It hollows something out. And the people in those seats, eating their food and enjoying the afternoon, probably didn't think of themselves as participants in a punishment. They thought of themselves as an audience, which is, of course, exactly what they were, and exactly what the system needed them to be. That image of a crowd laughing at engineered helplessness stays with me, because it reveals something about human nature that we prefer not to examine too closely. We like to think that justice and cruelty are opposites, that one cancels out the other. But what those arenas demonstrated, what that laughing audience demonstrated, is that the two things can occupy exactly the same space at exactly the same time, without any contradiction at all. And if you think that was the most uncomfortable version of that truth, wait. Because history occasionally produced moments where the punishment didn't just mirror the crime, it completed it. Like a sentence that had been missing its final word for years, and then someone finally supplied it in the most brutal and permanent way possible. There was a man, wealthy beyond any reasonable measure, whose entire life had been organized around the accumulation of more land, more influence, more resources, more power over the decisions that affected everyone around him. He moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who had never had to consider what anything actually cost, because the cost had always been paid by someone else. He made decisions that sent other people into danger, into poverty, into situations from which they did not return. and he made those decisions from a position of complete physical safety, surrounded by everything his appetite had gathered. And then, one day, the world outside that safety reached in and collected what it was owed. He was captured by people who had every reason to despise everything he represented. And what they did next is the part that history kept repeating, kept embellishing, kept returning to, not because of the physical detail of it, but because of what the detail meant. They gave him exactly what he had always wanted. They filled him with it. The substance of his obsession, made literal, made physical, forced into him in a way that left no room for the distance he had always maintained between himself and the consequences of his hunger. Whether every detail of that story happened precisely as recorded almost doesn't matter. The reason it survived, the reason people kept telling it across generations, is that it feels like the universe occasionally has a sense of justice that operates on a completely different level from anything a court could design. Not corrective, not deterrent, just perfectly, coldly exact. The punishment and the crime became the same object. And the man who had always taken whatever he wanted finally, irrevocably, received exactly what he had spent his life pursuing. The story endured because we recognized something true in it, that certain lives, lived in a certain way, seemed to contain their own ending already written inside them, waiting for the right moment to surface. Now here is where the tone shifts completely, because what comes next has none of that dark elegance, no symbolic perfection, no universe making a pointed joke. What comes next is something colder and more calculated, and in some ways more disturbing precisely because it was so deliberately ordinary. Some institutions discovered that the most effective way to break a person had nothing to do with pain, nothing to do with public humiliation, nothing to do with poetic justice or crowd laughter or iron devices. It was something you could deliver quietly, inside four walls, with no audience required at all. The discovery was this: take away a person's ability to produce anything meaningful, and you don't just exhaust them, you hollow them out at the level where identity lives. There were prisons and military institutions that built entire systems around this idea. Prisoners set to work on mechanisms specifically engineered to consume time and energy while generating absolutely nothing. A large wheel that required constant physical effort to turn and connected to nothing on the other side. Hours of climbing, pushing, working, sweating, and at the end of all of it, not a single thing in the world was different because of what they had done. No object produced, no task completed, no evidence that the day had contained any human purpose whatsoever. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think we underestimate how much of our sense of self depends on the simple ability to point at something and say, I made that. I did that. That exists because I was here. Strip that away completely and replace it with motion that produces nothing, day after day, week after week, and something starts to come apart that isn't visible from the outside. The body still functions. The person still wakes up, still eats, still moves through the hours. But the part of the mind that connects effort to meaning, that believes the next action might matter, that part starts to go quiet in a way that is very hard to reverse. The people who designed these systems weren't cruel in an obvious dramatic sense. They didn't shout or threaten or perform their authority. They just built a machine that consumed human beings from the inside out, dressed it in the language of productive labor, and scheduled it into the daily routine like any other institutional activity. And the most unsettling part is that it worked exactly as intended, every single time, on almost everyone it was applied to. Which raises the question of how much thought went into designing it, and whether that level of thought about how to dismantle a person from the inside makes the whole thing better or significantly worse. The quiet machine that hollows a person from the inside is terrifying precisely because it requires no anger, no passion, no visible cruelty at all. It just requires a schedule and a mechanism and the institutional patience to keep both running. But now I want to take you somewhere completely different. Because the next category of punishment abandoned all pretense of system and procedure and institutional calm. It handed the sentence directly to the street. And the street, as it turns out, is far less interested in procedure than any court has ever been. There were communities that had developed their own methods for removing someone they collectively decided didn't belong, and those methods operated outside any official framework entirely. No judge, no written sentence, no formal process. Just a crowd that had made up its mind, and a target who had no appeal available to them, except the goodwill of the same people who had already decided against them. What I find most disturbing about this isn't the physical element of it, though that was real and often severe. It's the way the crowd experienced it. Because the people participating weren't behaving like executioners carrying out a grim duty. They were having a genuinely good time. There was noise, there was energy, there was the particular high-pitched laughter of people who feel completely justified in what they're doing, and therefore feel no need to moderate themselves at all. The target was transformed in the process, not just removed, not just hurt, but converted into something the crowd could point at and feel better about themselves in comparison to. Stripped of dignity so thoroughly and so publicly that by the time it was over, the person being punished had ceased to be a person in any social sense and had become instead a lesson, a walking, involuntary demonstration of what this community did to people who violated its rules. The violence was real, but the violence wasn't the point. The point was the transformation. The point was that everyone watching, and in these public events everyone was watching, understood with perfect clarity that belonging to this community came with conditions. And the conditions were enforced not by a court with a gavel, but by the crowd with its hands and its voice and its absolute certainty that it was doing the right thing. That certainty is the part that should keep you up at night, not the anger. Anger implies doubt, implies emotion, implies that someone inside the crowd might eventually feel differently. Certainty has none of that softness. Certainty is the cleanest, coldest thing in the room. And a crowd operating from certainty is capable of things that no single individual within it would ever choose to do alone. That gap between what people do in groups and what they would do alone is where some of the darkest chapters of punishment history were written. And it leads directly to the next thing, which managed to be somehow even more intimate and even more permanent in its damage. If mob punishment was loud and fast and driven by collective heat, what came next was the precise opposite in every way except the outcome. It was quiet. It was slow. It was performed not by a crowd, but by an individual, sometimes two, under official sanction, with complete deliberateness in every movement. And it targeted something so fundamental to a person's daily existence that the damage it caused couldn't be left behind at the end of the day, the way a bruise eventually fades or a public walk eventually ends. It targeted the body they had to wake up inside every single morning. In communities where physical appearance carried the full weight of social identity, where how you presented yourself determined how you were treated in every interaction, from buying bread to negotiating a contract, the authorities found that the most devastating punishment required no special equipment. It required only a blade and the willingness to use it with surgical precision in the wrong direction. A man who had violated the social order wasn't simply marked in some visible but ignorable way. He was altered. The parts of his appearance that had signaled his membership in the respectable world were removed, selectively and carefully, leaving him in a state that announced his disgrace to everyone he encountered without a single word needing to be spoken by anyone. And here's the specific detail that I think makes this particular punishment so much more disturbing than it sounds on the surface. It wasn't total. That was the whole point. It wasn't shaving the head completely, which might have carried its own austere dignity. It was partial, calculated half removal. One side of the face, one side of the head, left exactly as it was. The other side taken down to nothing, so that everywhere he went, the contrast was the message. You could see simultaneously what he had been and what he had been reduced to in the same glance, on the same face. He couldn't hide it under clothing. He couldn't explain it as an accident. He couldn't even grow into a new version of himself quickly enough to escape it, because the growing back was its own prolonged humiliation, a weeks-long display of a man caught between his disgrace and his recovery, never fully one thing or the other. And every single person he passed on the street during those weeks received the same message, delivered silently, efficiently, and with zero possibility of misinterpretation. Some punishments ended when the sentence ended. The hair grew back, the walk through town was over. The exile returned after 10 years and rebuilt what could be rebuilt. There was a finish line, however distant and humiliating the path to it, but the category we arrive at now had no finish line. It was designed specifically to keep working after the official punishment was done, after the court had closed its records, after everyone involved had technically moved on. It was punishment that embedded itself into the physical world and kept broadcasting its message indefinitely to people who weren't even born yet when the original offense occurred. There were households forced to mark themselves in ways that turned their own home into a permanent public announcement of what they had done. Not a fine paid and forgotten, not a sentence served and released. The building itself, the walls the family woke up inside every morning, the facade that faced the street and greeted every neighbor and visitor and passing stranger, became the record. Painted in a color that meant one thing and one thing only to everyone in that community. There was no explaining it away. There was no renovating past it quietly. The mark was official, which meant removing it carried its own consequences. And leaving it meant living inside your own scandal every single day. Watching your children grow up under a roof that told the neighborhood exactly what their family had done before they were old enough to understand why. Think about what that actually meant across a generation. The original person who committed the offense eventually aged, eventually died, eventually passed out of living memory. But the house remained. The color remained. New neighbors moved in who had never met the original family and still understood, the moment they looked at that building, that something had happened there worth remembering. The punishment had become architectural. It had detached itself from the person and attached itself to a place, which meant it could theoretically outlast everyone connected to it by decades. That is a completely different philosophy of justice from anything we have covered so far. Everything else was about the individual, the body, the reputation, the mind, the social standing of a specific person at a specific moment. This was about the location, about making the physical environment itself carry the weight of what had been done there. And once you understand that some systems were willing to go that far, to punish a building, to sentence a street corner, to make geography itself into a form of ongoing shame, the next question becomes almost inevitable. If they were willing to do that to a house, what were they willing to do to a name? The answer to that question is one of the most unsettling things in this entire history, and it requires a moment to really absorb, because on the surface, it sounds almost abstract. Chiseling a name off a stone surface, scraping a face from a carved relief, painting over a figure in a public image. These sound like acts of bureaucratic tidying, like someone with a strong opinion about interior decoration. But the people doing it, and the people it was done to, understood something about these acts that the physical description completely fails to capture. In cultures where legacy was the primary measure of a life's worth, where the whole point of wealth and power and achievement was that it would be remembered, where men spent fortunes constructing monuments specifically so that future generations would know their name, the deliberate erasure of that name was not a minor administrative act. It was the closest thing to a second death that anyone had ever managed to design. A man could be gone from the world for years, and his name would still be doing work on his behalf, still influencing how people thought about his family, his decisions, his place in the order of things. The name on a building, the face on a public monument, the inscription on a ceremonial object. These were a dead man's continued presence in the world. They were how he kept speaking after he had stopped being able to speak. And when authorities decided that a man's legacy needed to be punished along with his person, they came for all of it. Systematically, methodically, with the same deliberateness that a careful craftsman brings to any precise work. Teams moving through public spaces, identifying every surface that carried the condemned name and removing it. Not defacing carelessly, removing cleanly, as if the name had never been there at all. The absence itself was the message, because an absence, if it is conspicuous enough, if the shape of what has been removed is still faintly visible, if people remember what used to be there, speaks louder than any presence could. Everyone who passed those blank spaces on the walls, those smoothed-over inscriptions, those statues with strangely featureless faces, understood immediately what had happened. They didn't need to be told. They could feel the shape of the person who used to be there, like a word on the tip of the tongue that you're no longer allowed to say. And that feeling, that awareness of a deliberate gap, was the punishment continuing to operate long after the man himself was beyond reaching. Erasing a name from stone is permanent. You can walk away from it, cross an ocean, outlive everyone who knew what happened, and the blank space on that wall keeps delivering its verdict to strangers who never met you. But everything we have covered so far, Every punishment, from the staged dinner to the hollowed labor to the scraped inscriptions, all of it shared one quality. It had a direction. It moved toward something. An ending, a result, a state the authorities wanted the punished person to arrive at. Even the worst of it had a logic, however twisted, that you could trace from offense to sentence. What comes next abandoned that entirely. Because the punishment I want to tell you about now wasn't designed to move toward anything. It was designed to stop, right at the edge, and leave the person stranded there forever. There were cases, documented and discussed across multiple legal traditions, where someone condemned to the most final sentence available was brought to the very threshold of that sentence and then pulled back. Not pardoned, not forgiven, not released with the slate wiped clean. Simply stopped at the last possible moment and returned to ordinary life with no explanation beyond the fact that the authorities had chosen, for their own reasons, not to complete what they had started. I want you to think about what that actually does to a person, because I think most people, when they first hear about this, focus on the wrong part. They think about the relief, the sudden overwhelming flood of it, the air in the lungs, the ground under the feet, the realization that the next moment exists after all. And yes, that relief was real and immediate and physical in a way that is hard to overstate. But relief is not the end of the story. It is barely the beginning of it. Because what followed that relief, what moved in quietly behind it over the hours and days and weeks afterward, was something that the relief had no power to address at all. The person who walked away from that threshold was not the same person who had walked toward it. Something had been permanently rearranged in the space between those two moments. They had felt the full weight of finality pressing down on them. They had looked at the world from the position of someone who was no longer going to be in it. They had made whatever peace a person makes with that reality, had compressed their entire existence down to its last few seconds, and then been abruptly informed that all of that compression, all of that letting go, had been unnecessary. The world snapped back open around them, and they had to climb back into it and live inside it, carrying the memory of how it had felt to be finished with it. Every ordinary moment afterward existed in the shadow of that memory. Every morning they woke up in a bed they had expected never to sleep in again. Every conversation they had was with a person they had expected never to speak to again. The punishment wasn't the threshold. The punishment was every single day on the other side of it, lived with the knowledge of how close the edge had been, and with no certainty ever again that it couldn't come back. The authorities who designed this understood something deeply uncomfortable about human psychology, that the mind does not easily unknow what it has known, that you cannot take a person to the edge of everything, bring them back, and expect them to simply resume. The experience doesn't stay in the past where it happened. It travels forward with the person into every future moment, uninvited, permanent, and absolutely impossible to explain to anyone who wasn't there. And so here we are, at the end of all of it. The dinner designed to terrorize without a single act of violence. The crowd that made laughter into a weapon sharper than any blade. The sealed container that turned an ending into a statement. The fraudster forced to swallow his own dishonesty. The iron device that turned a person into a walking announcement. The exile that dismantled a powerful man by simply moving him away from everything his power depended on. The democratic consensus that removed someone without anger or accusation. The body made to perform its own humiliation across miles of public road. The arena that packaged suffering as entertainment and sold it to an audience who felt completely fine about attending. The punishment that gave a greedy man exactly what he had always wanted. The machine that consumed human beings through pointless labor and called it discipline. The crowd that burned through certainty like fuel. The blade that left a man caught permanently between who he had been and what he had been reduced to. The house that kept confessing long after everyone inside it had stopped. The name scraped from stone so completely that the absence itself became the message. The threshold a person was brought to and then pulled back from, left to carry the weight of that proximity forever. Every single one of these came from a different place, a different culture, a different century, a different set of circumstances. And yet, the thread running through all of them is identical. The people designing these punishments were not satisfied with simply stopping bad behavior. They wanted the punishment to mean something. They wanted it to speak. To carry a message that outlasted the moment of delivery and kept working in the minds of the person punished and everyone watching. That desire, that need for the sentence to say something beyond just, "This is the consequence," that is not a historical curiosity. It did not stay in the past with the iron devices and the scraped stone. It is the same impulse that drives public shaming today, the same impulse behind social destruction campaigns, behind deliberate reputation attacks, behind every modern system that wants its punishments to be seen and felt and talked about long after the official process has ended. The costumes changed. The tools changed. The impulse never did. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If you had to choose right now, which of these punishments reveals the most about what humans actually believe justice should feel like? Not what we say we believe, but what the design of the punishment itself tells us we really want from it. Which one is it? Drop your answer in the comments, because I think the responses are going to say something very interesting about us as people, not just about history. If this gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from, and some of what is coming next is even harder to look away from.